Good. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. If everyone's ready, let's start, inshallah. We have a bit to cover, but before we go anywhere further, I'll kind of do the couple of announcements and a bit of background, because once we finish the Seerah, I don't think I'll be in a manner to speak any further. So first, after we finish the Seerah, we'll inshallah have Isha together, and then we will, if anyone's happy, we'll go to Rashes for dinner. So please join us. This is the last Seerah. We started about nearly a year ago, I think. So 21 weeks. This is the 21st week, and we are now finally wrapping up. There's a lot of lessons from this week. As you would imagine, in the Prophet ﷺ's last couple of days, the most important messages, the messages that he wanted not only to leave to his Sahaba, but to us Muslims that come after, is covered in this week. And what will happen is that we will go initially month by month, but as we go through this lesson, it'll start reducing to days, to weeks, to days, and then almost to hours, and then we're going to be covering minute by minute. So it is quite an in-depth and quite a different seerah to what we usually do. I contemplated a lot whether I was going to cover what happens after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and that's to do with the succession. I know that is a big question a lot of people have, and that is a very important thing to cover. However, I decided I won't. There is just a lot too much to take in this week, and I'm usually not in the best of emotional states after this session from previous experiences, so I will be not covering that, but I do recommend you guys go and from a trusted source understand what happened after the Prophet, because the journey with the Sahaba continues, and there's a lot that happens still after the Prophet ﷺ has passed away. Don't let the journey end here. I am very fortunate that usually it turns out that after every seerah I start a different seerah, so I've still got the Sunday school seerah, and we've just started that, so I can still spend time with the Prophet and the Sahaba, and when that ends I'll get to spend some time inshallah with another one. But for you guys who've been coming, don't let it end here. There are beautiful seerah books. Martin Ling is a good one I would recommend. There's the Omar series. If you're too lazy to read, watch the Omar series. Still keep connected with the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. Just really quickly, a side story was that a sheikh once got a call from this old lady and said, I have a real problem, can you come and help me? And the sheikh went to her, and the lady said, I haven't seen the Prophet ﷺ yesterday in my dreams. I see him every night. Yesterday I couldn't see him. And the sheikh said, what? You see him every night? He's like, yes, don't you see him every night? And the sheikh said, no, I don't. And he said, tell me, how is it that you see the Prophet every night? And he said, because every time I wake up, I think of the Prophet. Every time I eat, I think how he would have eaten. Every time I meet a friend, I think how he would have greeted the friend. Every time I sleep, I think how he would have slept. And so he comes to my dreams every night. It's a beautiful story that always sticks with me. So my recommendation is to always try to stay connected, because the Prophet ﷺ is alive, and keeping him part of your lives and your children's lives is very, very important. So don't let it end today. The other final thing is, as I am going through the seerah, I will say things like sign 1, sign 2. The reason is I'm counting all the signs where the Prophet ﷺ gave to let the Muslims know that his time was coming to an end. And it's very clear, 1, that he knew he was passing away, but 2, he was sending specific messages to us and the Sahaba. So it is, this week really is the most important week of all the seerahs that I've done, if you ask me. So inshallah we'll start with that. The situation in Arabia at this time is a bit of a complex one. There is a common thought that all of the Arabian Peninsula was Muslim. This is not quite true. It is true and it's not quite true. It's true in that a vast majority of the tribes had accepted Islam, but there were still tribes up in the Syrian regions who were still Jewish, who were still Christian. But all these tribes had, if not accepted Islam, had given alliance to Medina and had made alliances with the Prophet ﷺ. So either directly or indirectly, the Prophet ﷺ had an influence on all of the Arabian Peninsula. That does not mean, however, that all of the tribes were Muslim. It's in this context that the Prophet ﷺ we meet the Prophet ﷺ. Every year in Ramadan, the Prophet would retreat to the mosque during the middle month, the middle 10th days. But in this year, and the year that we are in now is 23 years after revelation, 632 AD, 11 years after Hijrah. If you want to remember that, it's 23 years after revelation, 632 AD, or 11 years after Hijrah. In this year, the Prophet ﷺ during Ramadan goes to the mosque for 10 days, but surprises everyone by staying the last 10 days as well. When he comes out, he tells his daughter Fatima, he says, every year in Ramadan, Jibril recites the Quran to me and I recite it back to him. But this year, he made me do it twice. I can't help but think my time has come. First sign. The month of Dhul Hijjah arrives, and the Prophet ﷺ for the first time decides to lead Hajj himself. So prior to this, remember who he said to lead Hajj? Do you remember? I think with Abu Bakr. I think it was last week or the week before. There was a Hajj pilgrimage that went before that, but the Prophet ﷺ himself didn't go. This year, for the first time, he says, I will lead this. And 30,000 Muslims, massive. If those of you who've been here from the Seerah from the early days, you remember we were talking about ones and twos and 20s and 30s and hundreds, thousands maybe. Now we're hitting 30,000 Muslims did Hajj with the Prophet ﷺ, and he led them. They go to Mecca and they do the actions of Hajj in Mecca, and he leads the pilgrims. And then he does something which surprises all the Quraysh. He starts leading the Muslims out of Mecca and towards Arafah. The Quraysh were used to doing tawaf and all the other steps. This was part of the Qurayshi tradition. But going to Arafah was not. So they started asking the Prophet ﷺ, why are you going to Arafah? Why is this change? And the Prophet ﷺ said, the traditions that you had, even though you were using it to worship idols, came from the Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ. These were his initial ones. You distorted it and corrupted it, worshipping idols, but it was from him. And going to Arafah was part of that, but that was one thing you guys forgot. You lapsed on that, and I'm bringing that back. The Prophet ascends the mountain of mercy, and on top, with tens of thousands of pilgrims all around him, all dressed in white. Imagine the scene. Literally, it would be like snow. All of them wearing ihrams around the mountain. He gives his last sermon. I would like you to request you to listen to this sermon as if you are there on that day with the Prophet ﷺ on the mountain. This sermon is probably one of the most important sermons and the most important messages he will give, and he gave it really from his heart. And he did not give it to the Sahaba there only, but he gave it to all of us. He says, O people, lend me an attentive ear, for I know not whether after this year I shall ever be amongst you again. Sign number 2. Therefore listen to what I'm saying to you very carefully, and take these words to those who could not be present today. O people, just as you regarded this month, this day, this city as sacred, so regard the life and property of every Muslim as sacred trust. Return the goods entrusted to you to their rightful owners. Hurt no one so that no one may hurt you. Remember that you will indeed meet your Lord, and that He will indeed reckon your deeds. Allah has forbidden you to take usury. Therefore all interest obligations shall henceforth be waived. Your capital, however, is yours to keep. You will neither inflict nor suffer any iniquity. Allah has judged that there shall be no interest, and that all interest due to Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle, shall henceforth be waived. Beware of Satan for the safety of your religion. He has lost all hope that he will ever be able to lead you astray in big things, so beware of following him in small things. O people, it is true that you have certain rights in regards to your wives, but they also have rights over you. Remember that you have taken them as your wives only under Allah's trust and with His permission. If they abide by your right, then to them belongs the right to be fed, clothed, and be treated in kindness. Do treat your women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers. And it is your right that they do not make friends with anyone whom you do not approve, as well as never be unchaste. O people, listen to me in earnest. Worship Allah. Say your 5 daily prayers. Fast during the month of Ramadan. Give your wealth in zakat. Perform Hajj if you can afford it. All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black have any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it was given freely and willingly. Do not therefore do injustice to yourselves. Remember, one day you will appear before Allah and answer your deeds. So beware, do not stray from the path of righteousness after I am gone. O people, no prophet or apostle will come after me, and no new faith will be born. Reason well the Quran and my example, the Sunnah, and if you follow these, you will never go astray. All those who listen to me shall pass on my words to others, and those to others again, and may the last ones understand my words better than those who listen to me directly. Be my witness, O Allah, that I have conveyed your message to your people. And then he recites Surah Al-Madiyah, verse 3. This day, those who cover over the truth of God has given up all hope destroying your way of life. So don't be afraid of them, rather fear only me. This day, I have perfected your way of life for you, completed my favor upon you, and have chosen for you Islam as your way of life. I get goosebumps every time I hear that. I don't know about you, but the Prophet ﷺ was speaking so much from his heart, and you could hear his emphasis, and he knew he was about to leave, and he kept saying, "Oh people, please listen." And isn't it heartbreaking that some of the things that he actually said we sometimes just disregard so easily, even though that was almost his final wishes. The Prophet ﷺ then returns from Mecca to Medina with the pilgrims. Around this time, another interesting thing happens, a bit of a side note. 3 false prophets appear. 3 people who claim to be prophets, while the Prophet ﷺ is still alive. One is Musaylama ibn Habib from Yamama. He writes to the Prophet ﷺ a letter, and he says, let's make a deal. Let's split the earth between us. You take half, I take half. You be a prophet, I'll be a prophet. The Prophet ﷺ responds with Surah Al-Araf, verse 128. And it goes like this. And this is all he sends back. Pray to God for help and wait patiently, for the earth belongs to Allah, and He gives it as an inheritance to whichever His servants that He wills. The final result will be those who were mindful of Him. That's all. He pretty much says, I don't even have time for you. Here's a verse of the Quran, contemplate on that. The second is Aswad ibn Ka'b from Yemen. He is very quickly killed by his own people. The third is a man by the name of Tulay ibn Khuwailid, who later surrenders to Khalid ibn Walid. And by the way, Musaylama, anyone knows what happens to him? Shortly after the Prophet ﷺ passes away, Washi kills him in a battle. Now, this one is hard for me. In the same year, one thing we know is in the same year, but there is uncertainty as to exactly when in the chronological order this particular thing happens. So some Seerah books actually leave this particular event out, but most scholars accept that this actually happened.
Now, there was one of those false prophets who came back to Islam.
Tulayha ibn Khalid. After he surrenders to Khalid.
Was that the lady or the...
I don't know if it was the lady. I think there was a lady. Maybe she was the lady. Not sure. But anyway. So this particular event, it's hard to point exactly where, but it is accepted by most scholars that it actually happened. The Prophet ﷺ decides to visit Jannatul Baqi with the Sahaba. If you've been to Umrah or Hajj, you know where Jannatul Baqi is. It's very close to the mosque. This is where all the Sahaba are buried. He goes to the grave and he says, "O people of the grave, you have beaten us, and inshallah we will follow soon. I give you glad tidings of Jannah." I'd say that's sign number 3. Some seerah say that it was at that time, some say when he was returning. The Prophet suddenly, he's usually quite joyous, especially when he's with the Sahaba, but his face turns ashen. They say his face looked so tired and so sad that it actually troubled the Sahaba around him. Some seerah say that he cried, some say he didn't. But they knew something was troubling him a lot. They obviously think that given he visited the grave, it's because he's weeping over the dead Sahaba. So they try to console him. And when they're trying to console him, the Prophet ﷺ says, "The only thing I will miss are my brothers." This is very odd for the Sahaba. They don't understand what he's talking about missing. And so they, as you would expect, they say, "Ya Rasulullah, we are here. Your brothers are here. We're here with you." And he says, "You are my companions. My beloved brothers are the sisters and brothers that believe in me but never had the chance to see me. They have not come yet. I wish only that I could have seen them." He's saying the only thing he misses, not his family, not his grandchildren, not his Sahaba, not Mecca or Medina or the mosque, none of that. He's not going to miss any of that. And he has no regrets over leaving any of that. The thing that is of second priority to him after being reunited with his Lord is you. It's that he could not see you be you and pray and see your children grow up and have that connection that he had with the Sahaba. That is what brought him to tears. I mean, what status, really? We're talking about Sahaba of such high status. He's not even saying, "I miss you." He's not even saying, "I'm going to miss you guys," because he had his time with them. He is crying because he's like, "I will not get to see those who will believe me, but they will never get to see me, and they haven't come yet." It always hits me very hard. Shortly after visiting Jannatul Baqi, the Prophet ﷺ tells one of his Sahaba, "I have been offered the keys of the treasure of this world and immortality, and then after paradise. But I have also been offered to meet my Lord soon in paradise." The Sahaba jumps and says, "Ya Rasulullah, choose the first option." And the Prophet ﷺ smiles at him and he says, "I have already chosen the second." After those words, when he is back in Medina, he gets the first sign of illness. He gets a headache. It starts off with a very mild headache. But very, very quickly, it progresses to a point where it becomes unbearable. Despite this, despite having a headache that was unbearable, the Prophet ﷺ still goes to the mosque, still talks to the Sahaba, still gives khutbahs, and still leads the prayers. At the end of one of the prayers, he says, "Allah the Great has given his servant an opportunity to choose between whatever he desires in this dunya and what Allah has kept for the next world." I'd say that's sign 6. The companions don't know what he's talking about. All of them are surprised. They can't understand what's going on, except for one. Anyone know who this person was? No. Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr hears these words and begins to cry straight away. And the Sahaba are looking at him and looking at the Prophet. And despite the Prophet having a headache, and despite the Prophet being in pain, his priority is to console Abu Bakr and comfort him. He says, I am most obliged to Abu Bakr for the favor of his company and property. If I were to make any other friend except Allah, I would have chosen Abu Bakr as a friend of mine. But for him I feel affection and brotherhood of Islam. No gate shall be kept open in the mosque except that of Abu Bakr's. And he tries to make him feel better. You will see in the next couple of minutes, the Prophet ﷺ's character really come out, where he always put everyone before him. Always, even till the very last second. The Prophet ﷺ then looks at the other Sahaba around him and he says this, I go before you and I am your witness. Your trust is with me at the pool, which I can see from here where I am standing. I do not fear for you that you will set up idols besides Allah, but I fear for you that you will compete and rival one another for the worldly things of this dunya. That's sign number 7. He's saying, I can already see the pool from here, but I'm going to witness for you. And your trust that you put in me, I will hold, and I will see you there. And he leaves that last message of, you're not going to be idol worshippers. But what does worry me is that this dunya will take over, and you'll start competing with each other for it. The Prophet ﷺ goes to Maymuna's apartment, which is that day it was for him to stay with his wife Maymuna. When he arrives at Maymuna's apartment, the headache is so severe and has now turned to a fever. After a while resting in Maymuna's apartment, he gets up and decides to visit Aisha, which, if you know how the mosque is organized, it's right next door. So he gets up and goes to Aisha's apartment. As he walks into Aisha's apartment, on this particular day, Aisha was having a headache as well. So the Prophet ﷺ walks in, and straight away, the first thing Aisha says is, oh, my head, to the Prophet, as he walks in. The Prophet looks at her and smiles and said, no, Aisha, my head. And then goes up to her and then takes her by the hand and looks at her to make sure that she's not too ill. This is a man who's suffering from fever and unbearable headache, yet manages to say a joke to his wife to make her feel happy. And his wife is complaining about a mild headache she's got. But despite that, he goes and checks up on her as well to make sure that she's not in pain. He tells Aisha, oh Aisha, this sounds weird for us if you think of it, but understand that his understanding of the reality is very different to ours. He says, oh Aisha, I wish your passing happened while I'm still here, so I can ask forgiveness for you, seek mercy for you, shroud you and pray for you and bury you with my hands. That's an odd thing, if you think of it for us when we tell someone who we love, we say, I wish I pass away before you. If you think of it, that's kind of selfish. You're saying, I don't want to go through the pain. The Prophet ﷺ saying, I wish you passed away before me, because then I could have prayed for you as a prophet. I could have given you that blessing. This troubles Aisha. This talk of death and the hereafter and him passing, it's happening very often now. And it's not like him, it's not in his character. So Aisha gets very upset. The Prophet ﷺ gets up to leave, go back to Maymuna's apartment, and he turns around and he sees that Aisha is troubled. So again he smiles at her and he says, oh Aisha, my head, and makes another joke out of it. This was the character of the Prophet. He knows he's about to leave, he's about to pass away. Yet he's worried about the discomfort that his wife has, and he tries to do what he can to comfort her, and he cracks jokes with her, even though he is in intense pain. When he arrives back at the apartment of the wife he's staying with, he asks the wife, where am I tomorrow? And she says, in so and so, whatever wife's house. And he says, where am I the next day? And he says, whatever wife's house. And where am I the next day? And this wife realizes what he's saying is he's trying to find out when he can be back with Aisha. Again, look at the character of the Prophet. If it was any one of us, we'd be like, woman, I'm dying here, let me just do what I want to do. But he doesn't, because he's like, my wives have rights. These are my wife's rights. And he doesn't even ask, he doesn't say, can I spend time with Aisha? He puts his needs and what he wants even as he's about to pass away last. But his wife picks up on the fact that he's wanting to spend that time with Aisha. So she goes secretly and talks with all the other wives, comes back to the Prophet ﷺ and says, Ya Rasulullah, I talked with all the wives and we have all agreed that we want to give as a gift our time with you to our sister Aisha, so you can stay with her. The Prophet ﷺ smiles and thanks them for it. He tries to get up from that apartment to go back to Aisha's, but he collapses. His feet won't hold him anymore. So Abbas and Ali come into the apartment and hold him up, and they lift him on either side and they take him to Aisha's apartment. The Prophet ﷺ had previously decided to send a force of 3,000 men to Syria under the leadership of Usama ibn Zayd. While the Prophet ﷺ is shivering in fever and holding his head in Aisha's apartment, news comes to him that some of the soldiers in this expedition are complaining about the fact that Usama ibn Zayd is being made the leader. Do you know why? He's a teenager, that's right. He's about 16, 17. He's a teenager, no battle experience. And he's leading middle-aged men who've been fighting in many, many battles. When the news reaches the Prophet ﷺ, he tries to get up again to go and deal with this problem, but he collapses again. So he tells his wives, bring 7 skins of water from 7 different wells and bring a tub for me, and I'll sit in the tub and pour the water over me. I've often wondered what the reasoning behind 7 skins. Was it divine revelation, or was it that the temperatures of the wells were different, that it would shock his system? I don't know. Can you understand his nature? He is pushing through. Any one of us in this situation would be moaning and lying on the ground and not budging and demanding people to look after us. Instead, he says, bring me a tub. He climbs into the tub and the wives pour water over him. They then help dress him, but the pain of his head is so severe that he's clutching his head. So they get a cloth and bind his head tight. And then with the help of 2 Sahaba, he is almost dragged to the mosque and he's placed on the pulpit. In the pulpit, he says this, no wonder now you contest Osama's leadership, for you have already contested the previous leadership of his father. Yes, by Allah, his father Zayd ibn Harith was one of the most beloved people to me. He was quite an efficient for leadership, and his son of his is one of the most beloved individuals to me after his father. So he puts this argument straight away to an end. He says, I love Osama and he's one of the most beloved to me, and I loved his father and he was one of the most beloved to me. This is why after the Sahaba used to call Osama the beloved son of the beloved. When he says this, the complaining stops immediately and the expedition under the leadership of Osama decide to leave. But as they reach Jurf, which is outside of Medina, Osama can't bear it anymore. The Prophet ﷺ was the closest thing to a father he had. Remember, Zayd ibn Harith has passed away now. And the Prophet ﷺ almost took on the role of a father and grandfather for him. So Osama can't bring himself to go on the expedition, so he tells the army to set up camp in Jurf, and he says, I will wait here till I hear news of what's happening to the Prophet. The next 2 weeks, the pain gets worse, and the Prophet ﷺ's health starts to deteriorate. For 2 weeks, he's going through this pain. Remember, there is no Panadol, there is no painkillers. He is in intense pain and he is in intense fever. By this stage, he can't stand on his own feet, let alone walk. He tries to lead the prayer, but he's unable to. So he tells Aisha, oh Aisha, tell your father Abu Bakr to lead the prayers. Aisha says, no, my father can't. He's too soft. He's grieving over you. He's missing you. He's always crying. The minute he starts to lead the prayer, he's going to cry. He's not going to finish the prayer. He can't do it. And the Prophet ﷺ says, Aisha, tell Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. And so he assigns Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. Over the next couple of days, the Sahabas come in and out to visit the Prophet ﷺ, but Aisha, after a few minutes, kicks them out pretty much, telling them that the Prophet ﷺ needs to rest. The exception to this is Fatima. Whenever Fatima comes, Aisha leaves the house so that the Prophet ﷺ and Fatima can have a quality father and daughter time together. On one such time, Aisha notices that the Prophet ﷺ leans towards Fatima and in her ear whispers something. And Fatima begins to cry. And then the Prophet ﷺ takes her gently and then whispers something else in her ear. And then she smiles. And when Fatima later leaves, Aisha goes up to her and says, what happened? Why did you cry and then smile? Fatima says, the first time he told me that he will not recover from this illness. And so I cried. So this is sign number 9. But then he told me, I will be the first from my family to be reunited with him. So I was happy. And that was true. After the Prophet ﷺ passed away, the first member of the family to die was his daughter Fatima. The Prophet ﷺ's pain was sometimes severe and sometimes less so. It will come in and fade sometimes. On one such time, the Prophet was in such severe pain that the wives were all gathered around him and were incredibly worried about him. Safiya was there and he said, "Oh Rasulullah, I wish I had your pain and you did not have this pain." She couldn't bear it anymore, seeing him suffer like this. The wives, though, who were there, they rolled their eyes, they looked at each other and began whispering. Despite the pain he was in and the fever he was having, he notices this. And he says, "Go rinse your mouths," to his wives. They say, why? Why are we rinsing our mouths? And he says, "For you are slandering your companion," and she spoke the truth. Even in that state, he's correcting the wrong. Even in that state when he can't walk, he can't stand up, he has barely any energy to keep his eyes open, yet he's telling them what's wrong is wrong to his own wives. Ayman, everyone know who Ayman is? She had another name. What was the other name? She was very beloved to the Prophet ﷺ. Anyone know Ayman? Ayman had the name of Barakah. Yes. Barakah was a slave that belonged to Amina. She was a young girl at the time. And when the Prophet ﷺ and Amina and Barakah went to Medina, this we're talking about when the Prophet was a very young child. And on their way back, the Amina gets sick and dies. This young girl, Barakah, looks after the Prophet ﷺ in the desert, middle of nowhere, no one's around them, and looks after him till another caravan comes and helps them. And even after, she takes on the role of a mother. I've told this story many times for those of you who haven't heard. One time when Bilal had an argument with another Sahaba, and this Sahaba got angry at him and said, "You're nothing but a black slave." And this Bilal he was so hurt, he went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "Ya Rasulullah, this Sahaba said this to me." And he got so angry, they say his vein popped out. He has a vein on the forehead that bulges when he's angry. And he called the Sahaba and he said, "Don't you know that I am the son of a white woman," referring to Amina, "and the son of a black woman," referring to Barakah. This was the Barakah. He loved her. Barakah later was called Ayman because he had a son from another person called Ayman. Later she married Zayd ibn Harith. She married Zayd ibn Harith and they had the son Osama. Do you see the connection and the love the Prophet had to this particular family? Ayman was looking after the Prophet ﷺ during this time, but she was also regularly sending updates to his son who was in Jurf. At one point, Osama couldn't bear it anymore. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether to go or to slay. He couldn't bear it, so he gets on a horse and rides back to Medina, unannounced. He comes back to Medina and he sees the Prophet ﷺ lying on the bed. By this time, the Prophet could not talk. He's just lying in bed, but he was fully conscious. Osama falls to his knees and grabs the Prophet and kisses him. The Prophet ﷺ raises his arms upwards with his palm towards the heavens above Osama, and then does that, turns his arm as if he's pouring something onto Osama. The scholars say that this was a sign that he was asking for the blessings from Allah and then asking for those blessings to fall on Osama. That was all he was able to do. Osama's torn. He doesn't know whether to stay with the Prophet or to follow the last instruction the Prophet gave, which is to go. Do I obey the Prophet or do I stay with him in his last moments? 16, 17-year-old boy. Think of us when we were 16, 17-year-olds. Did we even have a... And to go, his duty, his instruction was to lead an army of 3,000 in battle. And whether he will live or not, he doesn't know either. There's a reason why we say these companions were the greatest of humans. It's not just because they were the companions of the Prophet, it was their character. Osama, with a very heavy heart, leaves the Prophet and goes back to Jurf. Can you imagine how torn he would have been? The next day is the 12th of Rabi, 11th year of Islam, on the 8th day of June, 632 AD. So 8th of June, 632 AD. The Prophet ﷺ wakes up in Aisha's apartment, but he's feeling a little bit better. His fever has reduced, and he manages to struggle to his feet, and he actually can stand on his own feet. As he's standing, he hears the azan in the mosque. So he goes very slowly towards the mosque by himself. When he gets to the mosque, the Sahaba have already lined up to pray. And they see him and they all rejoice. They're all thrilled and they think that another miracle from Allah. He's recovered. The commotion is so great that you could actually hear it across Medina. When he saw the Sahaba lining up to pray, he smiled at them and gestured to continue. He said, don't let me coming interrupt your prayers. Imagine that. He's telling them, don't let me be coming interrupt. Continue praying. The Prophet ﷺ stood behind them for a while and watched them line up. And he had the biggest smile you can imagine on his face. Anas ibn Malik, we know Anas ibn Malik, who lived with the Prophet ﷺ for a very long time and served him. He said, I have never seen the Prophet ﷺ's face more beautiful than at that hour. Imagine the joy that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Anas ibn Malik, who sees the Prophet ﷺ's face on a daily basis, says, I have never seen his face more beautiful than when he stood and he saw the Sahabas lining up to pray. Imagine if the Prophet ﷺ was alive today. What joy would he have gotten? Or what sadness would he have given him? Two Sahaba step forward and help him. They take him by the arms and they guide him to the front. Abu Bakr had already given the takbir to pray. And so when he hears the commotion, he knows the Prophet's there. So he takes a step back to let the Prophet ﷺ come to the forward. The Prophet puts his arm on Abu Bakr's shoulder very gently and presses him forward again. He can't stand, so he sits down next to Abu Bakr on his right side. He sits right on his side and lets Abu Bakr finish the entire prayer. And the Prophet ﷺ prays behind Abu Bakr. Do you remember how many times this has happened where the Prophet ﷺ prayed behind someone? Abdurrahman ibn Auf was the first time. And it was in that we actually got the first sign, because he says no prophet leaves this world until he prays behind a pious man of his ummah. That was actually the very first time he made mention that the Prophet won't be alive forever. We covered that last week. This is the second time. He prays behind Abu Bakr. Now the joy amongst everyone, because everyone's like, the Prophet ﷺ's recovered, he's back, he's going to come back. The news is spreading everywhere. It reaches Osama in Jurf. Osama gets on a horse and rides straight back to the Prophet ﷺ. He gallops straight back. And he sees the Prophet ﷺ and he embraces him. And the Prophet says, set forth with the blessings of Allah. So think of it, Osama's so happy because the first time he saw the Prophet, he couldn't even talk. Now he actually is talking and he says, set forth with the blessing of Allah. So Osama gets back on his horse and heads towards his Jurf again to get the army ready to leave. The Prophet ﷺ goes back to Aisha's apartment, but those few steps that he took to the mosque exhausted him. He goes to Aisha's apartment and he collapses on the couch and he's completely drained. All his strength is now gone. He's lying on the couch and Aisha comes up to him and kneels next to him and takes the Prophet ﷺ's head in her arms and puts it on her chest. And he lies very heavily on her. Aisha's brother Abdurrahman comes to see the Prophet ﷺ, and he has a miswak in his hand. And Aisha notices that the Prophet ﷺ is staring at Abdurrahman's miswak. He's too weak to talk, he can barely talk. So Aisha realizes he wants the miswak. So he asks Abdurrahman for the miswak and softens it. He breaks it and softens it and gives it to the Prophet. And the Prophet manages to brush his teeth with the miswak. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine he knows what's happening and he wants to be in his best appearance. He wants to make sure that he has done everything he can to meet his Lord. So he takes a miswak and starts brushing his teeth in that state. This is not, I dare any one of you guys, okay, maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe you might, but really think of yourselves in this position, would you do that? I know I wouldn't. Soon after, the Prophet ﷺ loses consciousness. This is the first time he's lost consciousness. The whole household thinks he's about to pass away. He's not responding. They're talking to him. They're trying to wake him. He won't respond. He's still breathing though. 1 hour later, his eyes flicker open. And Aisha hears him whisper, "No prophet is taken by death until he has been shown his place in paradise and then offered a choice to live or die." Aisha understood that 1 hour where he was unconscious, Allah was showing him a vision of Jannah. And Aisha tells his wives, with tears in his eyes, "He will not choose us now." See, till that moment they were hoping the Prophet, because of the love he had for the Sahaba and the Ummah, they were hoping, because he kept saying, "I'm choosing my Lord, I'm choosing to be with my Lord." He kept saying it several times. They were still hoping that the last minute he will say, "No, I choose my Sahaba, I choose my companion, I will stay." Because he was given that option. And if he had said that, Allah would have allowed him to stay. He said that, he would have been immortal, he would have been with us now. So they were hoping, but when he said, "I have been shown Jannah and where I will be," Aisha tells his wives, "He will not choose us." And that's when the penny drops for them. The Prophet ﷺ then says these words, "With supreme communion in paradise, with those who Allah has showered favor, the prophets and the saints and the martyrs and the righteous, most excellent for communion are they." He's pretty much prophesying himself. He's prophesying where he's going. He's saying, what a beautiful communion. What an amazing companionship of those that Allah has loved and showered blessings on, and the martyrs and the prophets. How amazing. He takes a few deep breaths, and then Aisha hears his last words. He says, "Oh Allah, with supreme communion." And then he says nothing more. His eyes close, and Aisha feels his head grow very heavy on his chest, and then his breathing stops. And with those last words, the best of creation, to the Prophet of mercy and gentleness, the most loving of fathers and grandfathers, the most kind of statements and leaders, and the most compassionate to his ummah, and the seal of the prophets, goes to be with his Lord. Aisha lifts his head off his chest and places him on the pillow, and all the wives begin to cry. And she stands up with tears rolling down his face. And they leave the apartment to inform the Sahaba what has happened. I won't go too much into what happens afterwards. We all kind of know the story. We know that Omar refuses to accept and says, "Whoever says that the Prophet's dead, I will strike him down with the sword. He's like Musa, he's gone to be with his Lord, he's going to come back." There are some Sahaba who are literally in a fetal position crying. There are other Sahaba who don't know what to do. The whole city is in chaos until Abu Bakr comes and recites a verse of the Quran that says, "Those who follow the Prophet know the Prophet has died, but those who worship Allah know that Allah will always be alive." But there is one story that sticks out, and I will end with that. There was an old Sahabi who was crying and crying and crying and crying and crying, and they couldn't make her stop. And they tried to comfort her, and they were saying things like, "We will see the Prophet, we will see the Prophet, it'll be okay." And she said, "You don't understand. I'm not crying because the Prophet's not with us. I am crying because from this day onwards, humanity will not be able to hear the words of Allah come down straight away." They had gotten so used to any event happening, from the smallest to the biggest revelation coming. They had a hotline to Allah, the creator of the universe. And she's saying, how will humanity live? How will humanity survive when we don't have this hotline anymore? We forget because we don't have that hotline. We never had that, we never experienced that. But for these people, she was crying for us. Because she was saying, what are the people who are going to come after, how are they going to manage? And it was probably because of that the Prophet ﷺ showed so much love for us as well. So next time you feel that you're not very worthy, or you don't, that you try to beat yourself up, remember that next to seeing the Lord, his Lord, the Prophet ﷺ, the only thing he missed was not seeing you. Thank you for joining me for about an year doing the Seerah, and inshallah we've come to an end. And I've hoped you've enjoyed it. Like I said, please continue that journey with the Prophet ﷺ, continue to keep that connection. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Remember that, and today you just completed presenting the Seerah of the Prophet. Subhanallah, it's amazing.
We're very blessed to have him as ours. Very blessed.
And what about when those of death was due to poisoning?
Yeah, so if you ask what the cause of the death of the Prophet ﷺ, actually was said that it was, if you remember several weeks ago after the battle of Khaybar, there was a Jewish lady who provided food for them, and the food was poisoned. And the Prophet ﷺ took a bite but spat it out because it was revealed that it was poison. He said that it was that poison that has acted on it after, I think it was 4 years after, down the track. The scholars say, why did Allah allow that to happen? It's because the status of the Prophet ﷺ can also have the status of a martyr. Because if he died of natural causes, he wouldn't have the blessings of a martyr. But because of the poison, he now even has that status.
This is really amazing. Someone, a river, teachers, all this.
heart.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you everyone for